Hey everyone, welcome to part 3 of dropping the engine of a 2007 Volkswagen Touareg with the twin-turbo V10 diesel engine. If you've been following along, we've been disconnecting various components in preparation for dropping the engine, and this third video is going to be focusing on the components underneath of the car. The first video was disconnecting and removing the front clip, which houses the radiator and a handful of components related to the front of the car. The other video, the video that followed that, was a video that focused on everything at the top of the car, which included the power steering, reservoir, our fuel filter, ECM, and a handful of other wires that related to some of the EGR components and oxygen sensors. So you saw that in the other video. And in this video, we're going to be disconnecting things underneath of the car. So the things that we're going to be focusing on and disconnecting today are the transmission wires, the transfer case wires, the exhaust, the driveshaft coupler, as well as a power steering rack that's underneath here in the front. We're also going to be focusing on disconnecting the coolant lines that are tied into the Webesto, and I've got actually a replacement Webesto that I'm going to be installing. So that's not normal. Mine just doesn't give a computer reading, so I've got a new one that I'm going to be reinstalling installing once I take out this defective one. After that, we're going to be disconnecting the steering yoke, ball and socket, and then we'll be focusing on the suspension components in front that connect the drive shaft and the axle to the spindle and the air suspension that I have on this car. So we have to take all of those off in order to drop the engine, and we're going to start that right now. So let's get to it. And under the car we go. We are going to start disconnecting some connectors to the transmission and the differential. So let's slide under here. We'll get a light activated. Now that we're under here, we're going to start on the transfer case. So there are two connections. We've got one here, and then we got one here at the top. Use our pick and just gently move those, and then we're going to take the holder and just open that up and move that out of the way. What I'm going to also do is tuck them up and out at the top, and that's clearly out of the way. So 1 and 2 disconnected. We have 3 transmission connections to disconnect. So right behind the transmission pan, we've got 3 sensors and plugs that have to be disconnected. So we're going to try to do those nice and carefully. All right. There we go. So as a side note, I found this out a while ago. One of these 3 connectors on the original Volkswagen Touaregs had a very, very short cable right here that went into one of these pins. And what happened is that it would cause your car and the transmission to shift very, very harshly. And what ended up happening is that one of these wires got so pulled that it would disconnect and fray with age. So one of these actually caused a bunch of solenoid failure issues, and Volkswagen issued a technical bulletin where the solution was to repin this and just lengthen the wire. You didn't have to touch any of the solenoids here in the transmission. All you had to do was extend one of the wires. So if your transmission is clunky, or you have an original Volkswagen of like 2004 or 2005 and you're watching this, check one of those wires and make sure that it's not on its last little piece of copper. Let's disconnect carefully our next transmission connection, and then our third transmission connection. All 3 connectors are out of the way, and we're going to push those up on top of the transmission. Obviously, the reason why I'm trying to push them out of the way is so that when I lower the transmission, nothing gets caught as I'm pulling down on them. So that covers our electrical components down here. Next, we're going to disconnect our exhaust hangers. So I'm going to break them loose and drop one and two. So that is one DPF out of the way. And on the other side, we are going to crack loose the DPF hangers on the passenger side. And we've got two there. Next, we're going to disconnect the exhaust pipe coupling. Keep your nuts and bolts together. So undoing the exhaust coupling might require you to pry with a screwdriver. Otherwise, if you've done this before, you might be able to just slide this back and it exposes the coupling right here. So now we are independent on the passenger side. Let's go over to the driver's side. So we're done here. We've disconnected both exhaust pipes on the passenger and driver's side. Next, we take off the drive shaft bolts. And there we go. We got one of 6 out. We've got all of the bolts taken out. Next, we're going to grab a pry bar and push this back a little bit so that way we can separate this and try to take out this rubber drive shaft coupler. So you can see that I've pried the drive shaft away from the coupler and the transfer case. So when I drop the engine, there'll be a little bit of room for this to slide down and then forward there, and this will be stuck in place. So I think we're all set with the disconnection of the drive shaft coupler. Next, we're going to remove the steering rack cover. It's a brace that holds some hoses in place. Two 10mm nuts that hold that bracket in place. We have one 10mm bolt that holds the two pieces together. So we're going to undo that. And let's be smart. We're going to put that bolt back where it belongs. We're over on the passenger or the left-hand side of the car underneath, getting the remaining bolt and nuts that hold the power steering rack in place. And now we can remove the power steering cover. We've got one bracket off. And we have the other bracket off from the left side of the car. Now we're going to work on disconnecting some of the pipes to the Webesto. The Webesto heater is way up here, and we're going to take that out later. But right now I need to work on the cooling lines, and we need to sever them here and disconnect them using these hose clamps. These pipes up here are tied to the body of the car, and they don't move, but these pipes right here are tied into the engine and the engine cradle. So we got to just undo these two hose clamps, separate them, and we should be good. So I'm going to be making a mess here. I've got a 10mm bolt that holds these on and a handful of bolts up here. I'm going to take these off only to give myself some more slack. Our next step is to disconnect these hose clamps and separate the lines that are connected to the body of the car from the lines that are connected and that go to the engine. With our hose clamp tool, we're going to move them out of the way and disconnect hose 1. And we're going to use a small pick and go around the hose connectors. I've got a bucket to drain any coolant that we're going to be losing. And our Webesto connection is now severed. Now that we've got the Webesto lines disconnected, let's continue with the steering column. For us to successfully unscrew the steering knuckle, make sure your steering wheel is pointed straight ahead. What we need to do is we need to access the 16mm bolt that's up in here. And you can see that we've got it right on the top. So it's very difficult to see it, but this is the one that we're trying to get our hands on. After a little bit of persuasion, we were able to get our 16mm socket on it, and when we pull it out, there's the bolt. With my hand out of the way, you can see that I've successfully disconnected the steering column connection from the power steering rack. There is an electrical connection right here that we have to disconnect, so we're going to make sure that we take that off as well. And in no particular order, here's a recap of what we've disconnected from underneath the car. Driveshaft coupler. Exhaust connection on the right-hand side and left-hand side. Transfer case electronics. DPF hangers on the left-hand and right-hand side. Transmission connections, noting to shove the cables up and over on the top of the transmission. Power steering rack cover thingy. We narrowly avoided disaster and a major mess by disconnecting the Webesto connections. And finally, we've disconnected the power steering knuckle. We're not quite done yet under the car. We still have to disconnect the subframe bolts. We're going to do that a little bit later on as our final step. We come to the point of the engine drop that I despise. I don't like working on suspension, and I've got to do it twice. Once on the left-hand side and once on the right-hand side. Everything that we're going to disconnect related to the suspension includes the upper control arm, our electricals that relate to braking. We're going to disconnect our sway bar. We're going to disconnect our lower control arm from the strut. And we're going to disconnect the brake line. And just like that, we finished the front left suspension. I'm not going to bore you with the other side, so we're going to skip right over that and continue with the engine drop. To recap, what I disconnected on the suspension is as follows. We disconnected the upper control arm. We disconnected the wires that go to our brake pads. We disconnected the brake line. We disconnected the lower control arm connection to the air strut. We disconnected our sway link bar. And we disconnected connected another line up here that I'm trying to figure out where it is. There it is. One goes to the ABS sensor, the other goes to the brake pads. So now that we're done with the front suspension of this car, we're going to continue with the engine drop by grabbing our pallet jack and our frame that we've made from 4x4s. This is a pallet jack. On top of it, I have a makeshift frame that's going to be used to lift and jack up the engine. We've made it out of some 4x4s and some reinforced bracing that they use on decks. This is a very economical way to drop the engine from your car. I've measured it to the proper dimensions and it fits right underneath the cradle on which the engine sits. So we're going to use this and lift it up, attach a few brackets and a few mini jacks underneath on top of the wood and between the engine frame, and then we're going to lower this as one unit. So let's take a look and see what's involved with that. I've positioned the pallet jack right underneath the car in its proper place. We're going to have to now adjust the little mini jacks that I have. I would highly recommend using a couple of these as well. They're ultra heavy duty. Each one can lift, I think, about 6,000 pounds, and I've mounted them right on top. As we place the pallet jack underneath, we're going to adjust these and place them so that way they ride right on this cradle on which the engine is sitting. So let's get these jacks in place. And now time to unbolt the engine subframe bolts. We're going to start back here at the transfer case brace, and then we're going to work our way forward. And now time for the engine subframe bolts. These are the main ones. These are the big ones. Let's hop over to the other side. Oop, I forgot an AC line. Let's disconnect the ground cable next. Ground is disconnected, and here we have a fuel line that goes to the DPF sensors. I'm assuming this is to begin the ignition process of blowing out any of the soot. So we have to disconnect this fuel line. Ladies and gentlemen, I just cut that for the sake of simplicity. I'll use a barbed connection to stick those two hoses back to each other and then clamp them with a hose clamp. That'll be sufficient, and then I'll never have to deal with that problem again. That hose is just too hard to get to. We'll leave it with this makeshift upgrade. Now that we've got the engine lowered, we're going to just inspect all of the cables around the engine and make sure nothing is still connected. And then we're going to work on bringing the engine out. So one connection I forgot to take off is this other positive lead. So with one hex bolt here, we can take that off by snaking it behind this clip and placing it on our engine. And then I did forget also to disconnect the temperature sensor for the coolant, so don't forget that as well. And here's the first look behind the engine. With a little bit of space that you've gained separating the engine and the transmission, the next thing you're going to need to do from up here is disconnect the shift linkage cable. It's held in place by a C-clip, and it mounts into this bracket right down here. It's covered by an aluminum shield that's held in place with three 10mm bolts. Simply unscrew those three 10mm bolts, put the cover aside, and you'll have access to the shift linkage cable. Alternatively, you can disconnect the shift linkage cable from underneath the car by working your hands through the flex pipe and the transmission. Just reach your hands up with the ratchet, disconnect the three 10mm bolts, remove the shielding, and access the cable and disconnect the C-clip. Make sure you put the shift linkage cable up and aside so that way it doesn't get caught on anything as you move the engine out. Now right down there, we're going to get the transfer case hitting the bottom of the car. So as we prepare to take this out, we're going to jack the car up just a little bit. And there we have the engine out of our 2007 Volkswagen Touareg. I'm going to end this video here. I will insert a quick time lapse to show everything that I've done, so hopefully you'll find that helpful. Stay tuned for more videos where we're going to work on new turbos, downpipes, and some other upgrades on this engine.